Tony Scott or Ridley Scott? You see that?
Yeah.
Oh, that's a pretty good question right there.
I almost want to say Ridley.
Why?
And that's mostly because of just the sci-fi
Aspect
of like creating Alien. But as a color grader, I would pick Tony because he did so much stuff with, you take the film that he'd shoot on and run it through the cross-processing. So you'd run it through the wrong film processing fluids. Like if you've ever done like stuff in the darkroom, you'll know that you have like your developer, stopper, and stuff like that. And the different chemicals work with different kinds of film. So he'd purposely run it through the wrong things. And that's where you get movies like Domino. It got to the point where the film like would crumble and they'd have to reshoot.
Or they would just not have footage. They'd be like, we can't use that anymore.
Because he put it through so many things that film wasn't meant to be through. But he'd also combine things like hand cranked film into his movies. So he was really experimenting with like the look side of things.
Yeah.
And like that's where I really love like pushing the idea, pushing the concept. But then Ridley has like the big picture stuff. Really, for me, it's both. I know it's like kind of a cop-out thing, but I've been heavily inspired by both.
If you went into a Ridley Scott film or a Tony Scott film and it wasn't a sci-fi for Ridley Scott, what I'm trying to point out is that Ridley Scott has a Ridley Scott cinematography style, no matter what cinematography he works with. Mm-hmm. And Ridley Scott adjusts a little bit, almost like Danny Boyle, to create the perfect environment for what he's shooting. But all his sci-fis have a good echo to him. Mm-hmm. But when Tony Scott does films, like his like 80s and 90s films, it like as soon as you start watching, you're like, oh, this is a Tony Scott film. It's like, it's so foggy, like everybody's sweating for some reason.
Yeah.
Or like that famous scene in True Romance is whenever they're in the scene, they're in the trailer and they have that discussion and there's like two lights in the room and then he like cranks up the contrast so that the blacks are harsher than they need to.
Yeah.
And then every light you can see where it's coming from. That's what I think of when I think of Tony Scott. And that's why I say like Tony Scott has a style. Ridley Scott is king of like the sci-fi elements. Ridley Scott could do anything, but like that allows it to where like if anybody came into it and they didn't know it was Ridley Scott, they'd be like, this is a good movie. But if you went into a Tony Scott movie, especially in the 80s and 90s, you'd go, oh shit, that's a Tony Scott movie.
Yeah.
Tony Scott for his aesthetic, like I want to make movies like Tony Scott in the 80s. Ridley Scott for his sci-fi, into the story. If someone were to give me as much money as I wanted to, I'll do with Ridley Scott. If someone said, I want you to make a low budget movie that has an atmosphere in every scene, Tony Scott.
Yeah.
How's that?